There were two divisions to choose from. He decided, based on his very misinformed intelligence, that he would send the 32nd, not because it was the most prepared, but because it was the least prepared.
In the heat of August 1864, a group of war-weary Union soldiers paused at their Virginia campsite for what seemed like a simple photograph. A brief moment of stillness captured before duty called them back to battle. The men, hardened by years of conflict, gathered under the oaks with no idea that this image would one day draw the attention of experts far removed from the war. When modern eyes looked closer, what they found hidden in the background was enough to stop them cold. What could possibly be lurking in the shadows of a scene meant to honor sacrifice? Look closer and decide for yourself. The 32nd Infantry's Camp. In August 1864, the 32nd Infantry Regiment of the Union Army established its camp beneath towering oaks on the edge of Petersburg, Virginia. The trees offered scattered relief from the smothering heat, their limbs creaking faintly as if echoing the weariness of the men below. The ground, churned by wagons and boots, gave off a damp, earthy scent mingled with smoke from small cooking fires and the sharp tang of oil used on weapons. The camp itself was a patchwork of canvas tents, stacked crates, and hastily constructed lean-tos, each space claimed by men determined to carve out a semblance of shelter amid uncertainty. Life in the camp was governed as much by the sights, sounds, and smells as by orders from superiors. The rhythmic clatter of tin cups against canteens, the hiss of boiling water, and the rasp of whetstones sharpening bayonets filled the air. Smoke hung low, clinging to the humidity, blurring the edges of tents and figures, and lending the entire encampment an otherworldly feel at dusk. The men, conscious of being so near the front lines, moved with a kind of quiet urgency, keeping their kit close and their weapons within arm's reach at all times. Unquestionably, this environment had a nature of the most personal solitude than fellowship. Though a glimpse or a brief exchange may be dear to exuberance among the soldiers, soldiers would etch initials on musket stocks, darn ragged boots, and polish belt buckles with bits of cloth, all making little pieces of control for themselves amid such a large chaos. The veterans born of fighting hardened, keeping their eyes pinned to the horizon, their ears tuned into every gust of wind and sound that might announce the dawn of danger. Sleep came often in little fits and disguise for a few hours at a time, to a disruption that reminded him of the smoke of gunfire and the almost plaintive sound of the whippoorwill echoing along the tree line in their company. The mood in the entire camp had typically become more or less liminal, taken character by the fact that, during that time, battle was not wholly engulfing it from all sides. It was amidst such a place that the 32nd Infantry dithered between uncertain past contendants as to what might come next. From every detail of the camp, the angle of the tent pole, the tidiness of the stacked artillery box waiting within, the scanty embers left behind by a common fire. It could be said these days that men were preparing themselves for purposes beyond drill and orders. And it was here, in this little confined area beneath the oaks, that the 32nd waited, not just for orders or action, but for that unknown which war always held in reserve. But what seemed like an ordinary day at camp was about to be captured in a way no one could have imagined. Daniel Rohr's Fateful Photograph. Daniel Rohr arrived at the 32nd Infantry's camp as the afternoon sun bore down over Petersburg's weary landscape. A seasoned war photographer, Rohr had spent months traveling from one battered encampment to another, documenting faces that might soon be lost to history. The heat was oppressive, and the faint sound of gunfire echoed from the distant front lines. Undeterred, Rohr moved carefully across the uneven ground, carrying his heavy wooden camera and a single precious glass plate wrapped in protective cloth. His intent was simple, but profound: to capture a moment of the regiment's existence before fate, in whatever form it came. erased these men from the living world. As he set up his camera, Rohr called out to the soldiers with a mixture of formality and weariness born of experience. His words were an invitation, but also a reminder of what the photograph would mean. A piece of themselves preserved for those left behind. The men responded slowly, their movements deliberate and heavy. They gathered not out of excitement, but from a sense of duty, not to history, but to their families. Some brushed off dust, some adjusted their battered uniforms, and a few managed wan smiles for the sake of loved ones they feared they might never see again. Each man took his place, conscious that this image could become the final link between themselves and home. Rohr worked at a speed that seemed professional, knowing both how to make the most of all the gears he had and the eroded patience of his subjects. He adjusted the lens, made it glare-proof, and went silently into the countdown while everyone held the poses. The click of the shutter was quick, capturing an instant that, to the soldiers, might have felt unremarkable at the time. That unnoticeable photo, whose impact these soldiers could not realize when it was captured, did not just freeze their likenesses, but something far more haunting: the presence of an unspotted figure whose treason would soon seal many fates in that frame. But this photograph, meant as remembrance without intention, preserved the sign of a shadow that already lurked in their midst. Rohr returned north after the war. He left behind the battlefields that he had already documented, but carried with him the melancholy of their faces. He opened a little studio and, for the remainder of his days, shot wedding, family, and municipal events, far away from the violence that he had seen. His negatives from the war were bundled together and stored away, and scattered over time. Many destroyed by age, accident, or neglect. None, however, though by pure chance, the plate carrying the image of the 32nd Infantry hung in there. The fresh recruit. Among the soldiers of the 32nd Infantry, Caleb Morgan stood out not because of his uniform or his stature, but because of what he represented. Youth untested, hope not yet crushed, and grief that still clung fresh. At just 18, Caleb had joined the regiment weeks earlier, stepping into ranks filled with men who bore the marks of years at war. Where others moved with the heavy gait of the battle-worn, Caleb's posture remained upright, his kit arranged with care, his gaze alert though shadowed by sorrow. The loss of his brothers, Daniel and Eli, both casualties of the conflict, weighed on him more heavily than his gear ever could. Caleb's presence was a quiet contrast to the hardened faces that surrounded him. He was respectful, observant, and always just slightly apart, never quite merging into the camaraderie of the older men, yet not seeking isolation either. His grief was expressed not in words but in small, deliberate acts. The precise way he folded his blanket, the way he stood at the edge of groups, rather than at their heart. Though young, Caleb carried himself with a gravity that came from mourning, and from the awareness that his fate might soon mirror that of his brothers. At the summons for the photograph, Caleb obeyed with the same quietude that had marked all his movements since entering the regiment. He took his place in the back of the group, a position that marked both the subordinate status of his rank and his instinct to keep himself a little separate from the rest. His hands spoke to anyone who could see them. One of his hands rested lightly on the canteen, as if searching for steady ground, while the other was clenched behind his back, as if holding back unspoken fear or determination. A battle-scarred officer, seeing Caleb's discomfort, offered a half-kind, half-stern reminder to keep up the front for the image that would endure beyond them all. Caleb tried, managing to conjure a flicker of a smile before it returned to solemn reality. A moment in time, Caleb became the very model of innocence on the edge of destruction, and a youth caught at the crossroads of history. The picture would stamp him forever with fellow soldiers he hardly knew, in what should have been a scene of remembrance turned silent witness to loss and betrayal. Therefore, Caleb's glass plate is a reminder of everything in which hope remained unfulfilled, every possible life that was aborted, and the hushed bravery of those who bore their burdens in silence. The hidden observer. The photograph of the 32nd Infantry at their Petersburg campsite was long seen as a simple, solemn record of soldiers enduring the hardships of war. Captured beneath a canopy of oaks, the men stood or sat in wearied poses, their faces etched with fatigue, their eyes reflecting the weight of what they had seen and what they feared was still to come. For generations, viewers focused on these central figures, reading into their postures and expressions the human cost of the Civil War. No one imagined that behind these visible faces, the lens had captured something far more enigmatic. Only when examined closely did the photograph's secret begin to emerge. In the upper right quadrant, where branches intertwined and shadows fell thick, the faint outline of what seemed to be a man became visible. At first glance, it was easy to dismiss this shape as an imperfection of the plate or a trick of the light. But as the image was carefully studied, the lines sharpened into the unmistakable features of a hidden figure, a man positioned just beyond the group, elevated slightly as if observing the scene below. His presence was not accidental. His stance suggested intent and secrecy. The eeriness of the countenance was that Maya was hiding behind the green, natural camouflage of leaves and branches, because the face showed very disturbing clarity. The angular jaw, the mouth turned down, and eyes that appeared to peer through the foliage with unnatural focus set this particular figure apart from any illusion created by age or damage to the glass. He is not part of the group. He is not a brother in arms, captured in some moment of rest, but something other, an unseen observer whose gaze was fixed not on the camera, rather than on the men themselves. There was no shared tie arising from his posture, only an eerie detachment that suggested purpose beyond the scene. This mysterious voyeur shadowed what had seemed a pure record of comradeship. The photograph, to freeze an ephemeral moment of unity and dignity, became instead just a new riddle inviting fresh scrutiny through the lens. Who was the man hidden in the trees? Why had he been there, unrecognized by those so near? The presence of the man changed the very meaning of the image from a portrait of weary soldiers to evidence of some deeper, unseen drama being played beyond the frame. The photograph's long journey. The glass plate that held the image of the 32nd Infantry began its improbable journey shortly after the moment was captured in 1864. When the war's violence finally quieted, Daniel Rohr packed away his battlefield negatives, each fragile plate a silent witness to the cost of the conflict. Returning north, he transitioned from the chaos of war to the calm of civilian life, opening a modest portrait studio where he photographed families, weddings, and local events. His war negatives, wrapped in paper and tied with twine, were stored in attics and closets, reminders of a chapter he did not often speak of. These plates, vulnerable to time's decay, were scattered after his death, with many lost forever to fire, mildew, or careless handling. Among the few that endured was the plate bearing the 32nd Infantry's photograph, though its survival owed more to luck than preservation. Changing hands over the decades, the plate passed through estate sales and private collections without attracting serious attention. At some point, it found its way into the belongings of an amateur Civil War enthusiast, someone passionate about relics of the past, but without the resources or training to recognize its deeper significance. Wrapped in flannel and placed inside an old tobacco tin, the plate was treated as one more curiosity among buttons, belt buckles, and bayonets, hidden in plain sight as generations came and went. It has been years now since the plate remained silently undisturbed, its value unknown to an unfortunate fellow too far removed from its nobler calling. The collector died, and his estate was to be sorted by his nephew, a retired dealer in antiques. During what is almost a ritual estate clearance auction, the tin fell under his scrutiny. But the dealer saw only another item for his next auction, another vintage photograph of common militaria. Barring any indications of what lay inside, the glass plate was catalogued. Thus, vintage Union Army camp photo on glass plate, affording very little, if any, value beyond that which was gleaned from the auction. Those involved in the listing had given little thought to the fact that the simple artifact might carry within itself a clue that might one day turn a piece of Civil War history on its head. Not by design, but oddly enough, it was through listening to Dr. Lauren Hensley that the rediscovery of this photograph took place. While she was going through an online catalog in search of something else, her eye caught that picture with its serene yet striking composition, which expressed all the human issues arising out of the conflict. Be it from the very heavy lines on the faces, be it the stillness of the men at rest, something engendered action on her behalf. Following her gut feeling, she managed to acquire the plate for the National Military Archives. And from that point, the metamorphosis of a mere artifact soon began, the key to unlock the inglorious tales of betrayal, espionage, and the unseen hands guiding the destiny of men. Little did anyone know, the real story hidden in that plate was waiting for modern tools to reveal it. Technology unmasks a saboteur. When the glass plate arrived at the National Military Archives, it was treated like any other artifact slated for preservation and study. Dr. Lauren Hensley and her team approached the restoration with care, gently cleaning the fragile surface and digitizing the image to ensure its survival in modern formats. The photograph was folded into a broader initiative to build interactive exhibits, using technology to illuminate the personal stories behind historic faces. Artificial intelligence tools offered new possibilities, allowing researchers to match unidentified individuals to military records, pension files, and enlistment papers with remarkable precision, breathing life into names long lost in dusty ledgers. The early stages of analysis went as expected. The software successfully identified several soldiers in the image by cross-referencing visible unit badges and facial features with enlistment data. Caleb Morgan was among those matched, his youthful face aligning with records of his arrival in July 1864 and subsequent hospitalization weeks later. It was only as the team moved beyond the obvious, enhancing the background to enrich the digital exhibit, that something startling surfaced. In the upper right quadrant of the photo, nestled among tree branches, the faint outline of a human face began to emerge, as if the photograph itself had guarded a secret all these years. It was familiar, yet strange. The photo sharpening from the software tools. The cold streaks through noise reduction, smoothed, and shadow balancing brought out some hidden lines, making it appear completely clearer, sharper, even than reality. Then, finally, the AI system declared names the same as it had done for others. Elias Finch, it said as a result, stiffening the entire atmosphere. An old photograph forgotten within military archives, a mugshot entry for 1863 on a suspected infiltrator, poked and prodded by gossip of war sabotage. The jaw's sharp angles, the downturned mouth, and unnervingly perceptive eyes trained on the soldiers, even when still, unmistakably, belonged to Finch. This was a technological breakthrough, but also a ghostly sight of history's hidden dangers. The crucial moment of discovery converted the plate from a memorial of camaraderie into a dark frame, a photograph containing proof of betrayal waiting to be uncovered. Finch was for decades such a figure, nothing more than an appendix in scattered reports, his true reach undefined. Now, technology has provided historians with something they would never have expected. Everything about face-on, frame-in, and damning. The artificial intelligence tools did not just define a man with a moment. They brought to light the depths of deception that had flavored stories long before she was told of those who never returned from the fields of Virginia. The Phantom Infiltrator. Elias Finch operated in the shadows of the Civil War, his name rarely appearing in official accounts, his presence often suspected, but never confirmed until that photograph revealed his face. Finch was a master of deception who slipped between Union and Confederate lines, adopting new identities with ease and leaving confusion in his wake. Among his most successful disguises was that of a Union cartographer, Edward Marsh, a quiet figure who offered trusted guidance to commanders at the most crucial moments. He did not rely on violence or brute force. Finch's weapon was trust itself, and his skill lay in planting seeds of doubt, altering plans subtly enough to escape suspicion until the damage was done. Finch's tactics worked not through dramatic acts of sabotage, but through slow, corrosive misdirection. He tampered with maps, redirected patrols, and supplied false reports, always departing just before his deceptions bore deadly fruit. Supply trains went astray, cavalry units found themselves misrouted, and infantry regiments advanced into positions that left them exposed. Commanders, convinced they were acting on solid intelligence, often didn't realize the truth until it was too late. The genius of Finch's infiltration was that his lies were woven so seamlessly into trusted channels that no one questioned them until disaster struck. The downfall of Finch came in the events surrounding the Third Battle of Deep Bottom. But just days after this picture was taken, the 32nd Infantry followed arrogant orders from Finch, engineered info, and marched directly into an ambush that shattered the regiment. Other dramas of that day were filled with contradictory orders and movements that did not fit the scouts' own reports. When Finch's face peeped from the picture's background, though, everything became clear. The quiet figure who had offered guidance was the very man who orchestrated their downfall, vanishing into the fog of war before his betrayal could be confronted. The end for Finch has somehow become a riddle. Although his name remained among the wanted well after the conclusion of the conflict, he was never arrested, nor was any grave authenticated as his. His legacy was one of corrosion rather than explosion. That is, the decade of trust had been accompanied by schemes undone from within. So long overlooked, the photograph now became the first incontrovertible evidence, tying him to the damage he had wrought. It turned the myth of the shadowy infiltrator into a documented reality, finally giving form to the specter that had haunted Union records for generations. The Deep Bottom Disaster. The Third Battle of Deep Bottom, fought in August 1864, would come to be remembered as one of the most confounding and tragic episodes of the Civil War for the 32nd Infantry. What should have been a carefully coordinated advance turned into a catastrophe as the regiment marched straight into a deadly ambush. From the start, nothing about the operation unfolded as expected. Orders arrived with unusual speed and certainty. Maps bore subtle but fateful errors, and the routes the infantry followed placed them in exposed positions. The men of the 32nd, already weary from long months of campaigning, moved forward trusting in the information provided, unaware that their trust had been fatally exploited. The disaster was marked not by a single tactical blunder, but by a chain of decisions shaped by deception. What made the ambush so effective was its precision. Union forces were drawn into terrain that offered no cover, while Confederate forces lay in wait, fully prepared for their arrival. The speed with which the 32nd Infantry was overwhelmed suggested an enemy forewarned of their every move. The chaos of battle left survivors grappling with unanswered questions. How had their movements been so badly misjudged? Why had their own scouts' warnings been ignored in favor of newer, flawed intelligence? The sense of betrayal was felt even then, though its source remained hidden. The reality was grim after the bloodbath, where confusion on the battlefields gave way to grim discourse. There were soldier survivors who had orders that did not match what they were seeing on the field. Some maps misdirected them and put them on hazardous paths. Included in that compendium of voices was Corporal Jeremy Holden, who, in time, would write in his private correspondence a letter to a man who had influenced the regiment's last march in silence. It was a new cartographer who had begun to transfer the maps, a figure who stayed in the background, always writing, always observing. What transformed the tragic incident at Deep Bottom into a ghastly narrative of betrayal was the final discovery of Finch's hidden presence in the camp photo of the 32nd Infantry. That quiet figure among the trees had not only watched, he had set the stage for ruin. No, the gruesome battle that took away innumerable lives wasn't simply conceived out of miscalculation. It had its foundation in a cleverly contrived deception. The ambush was the last fatal act in a campaign of infiltration that had reduced the regiment to a point where it was incapable of defending itself. Jeremy Holden's lost letter. For decades, the chaos of the Deep Bottom disaster was recorded only in official reports and fragmented memories. Yet, it was a forgotten letter, never mailed and buried in archival obscurity, that helped bring the full truth into focus. Corporal Jeremy Holden, one of the few survivors of the 32nd Infantry's doomed advance, had written to his mother in the days following the battle. His letter began, as so many did during the war, describing the hardships of camp life, the miserable rations, the stifling heat, the bone-deep fatigue that settled over men who had seen too much. But as his words flowed, Holden's tone shifted, darkened by unease and suspicion that he could not shake. In his letter, Holden confided his growing conviction that the regiment had been led into disaster not by chance, but by deliberate misdirection. He wrote of orders that arrived too swiftly and maps that bore unfamiliar hands, of a march that felt orchestrated toward failure. His most striking observation concerned a man who had quietly gained influence in the days before the ambush, a new cartographer, reserved and always at work on papers that few questioned. Holden described him not by name, but by presence. Quiet fellow, always writing. No one knew his name. Had it remained in obscurity ever after, this letter might have effectively been relegated to the status of a footnote and an execrable piece of wartime distrust in some old file. It lay in a cabinet marked "Suspicious Correspondence," while the crumbling paper bore mute testimony to Holden's gut feeling, a soldier's instinctive grasping at reasons for a betrayal he felt but could not prove. Tied with the rediscovered photograph and AI identification of Finch from the letter, now the memories shared by Holden felt like an echo from the past. He had every reason to be anxious. The man he described was the infiltrator who led the regiment to its destruction. Holden did more than confirm Finch's treachery through modern means. His letter put flesh and bone on that story. It articulated the sense of chaos and doubt and heartbreak of a soldier who felt something was very wrong but was powerless to do anything about it. It was a memory that Holden wanted to convey down through the generations. Deep Bottom's tragedy became, depending on the view, not only a strategic nightmare, but, more humanly, also a story of trust broken, of danger ignored, and of warnings drowned in the noise of war. Yet what historians uncovered beyond the letter would cast the photograph in a far darker light. Legacy of Betrayal. The photograph of the 32nd Infantry, intended as a simple token of remembrance, evolved into one of the most haunting and instructive artifacts of the Civil War. Captured on a sultry afternoon in August 1864, it was meant to freeze in time the faces of men who bore the weight of battle, giving their families a keepsake of fathers, sons, and brothers at a moment of quiet before the storm. For generations, the image was viewed as just that, a solemn portrait of comradeship. Yet the discovery of Elias Finch's hidden figure transformed the photograph into something far more disturbing, irrefutable proof of betrayal hidden in plain sight. The image, now known as the Finch exposure, became a touchstone for military historians and scholars of espionage alike. With Finch's identity confirmed, researchers revisited records of failed operations, misdirected patrols, and botched supply movements, uncovering patterns of deception that had once been attributed to confusion or bad luck. The photograph served as both evidence and symbol, a reminder that the most dangerous threats often come not from without, but from within. What was once a keepsake became, instead, a document of sabotage, its pixels containing truths that reshaped the understanding of an entire campaign. The photograph provided long-awaited answers for the descendants of the 32nd Infantry. Families who had passed down medals, letters, and fragments of memory without fully grasping the circumstances of their ancestors' sacrifice now began to see the bigger picture. The image articulated an unutterable grief that had been borne by generations, allowing for understanding as to why closure of sorts was never possible for so many, so suddenly severed from loved ones whose stories of their death were always filled with gaps. The knowledge gained from finding Finch in the picture would go some way in healing these wounds, even though that knowledge came far too late to affect history. As now archived at the National Military Archives and placed in a climate-controlled display for the ongoing exhibit titled Saboteur in the Frame, the picture attracts spectators not only for its high historical significance, but also as a chilling reminder of the true face of trust and the treachery of war. Hitherto little noticed, the dim figure amongst the trees now serves to identify how easily deception can slip into close relations. Further adding to the inheritance of the photograph are the newly come-up testimonies from the journal of Lieutenant Henry Clayborough, which bolster the weight of significance it already carries. On September 2, 1864, Clayborough wrote in some of his entries, saying, "That day, we posed for our portrait, believing ourselves momentarily safe. Even then, however, I felt unseen eyes upon us, though I spoke it not for fear of seeming mad." If this story made you look at history a little differently, give us a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating discoveries. And before you go, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss what we uncovered next.